We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Beis Meseches Shevuos. This is Shevuos Daf 7b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing the carbon olav v'yored, which is brought if in a situation of Yedias HaTumah B'Shogeg, and the Gemara said that that's talking specifically about Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav. The Gemara in the previous Amud brought a source for eating Kodesh, that in such a situation, again, if the Kodesh is eaten B'Tumah B'Shogeg, then the carbon olav v'yored is brought, and the Gemara was looking for a source that is true by Mikdash as well, if one enters the Beis HaMikdash when they're Tameh, and the Gemara in the middle of saying that it comes from Tumaso. It says that language of Tumaso, it says that when it comes to carbon olav v'yored, Uchsiv Hasam, and it's written over there by Tumas Mikdash, it says Tameh od Tumaso vo. Rashi says Uchsiv Hasam betumas Mikdash beparshas Paraduma. This is talking about the Tumah, the Beis HaMikdash by the parsha of the Paraduma. It uses the same language of Tumaso. Malahalan Tumas Mikdash, just like over there it's talking about Tumas Mikdash. Afkan Tumas Mikdash. So too over here it's talking about Tumas Mikdash. That is the source for Tumas Mikdash. And so the Gemara continues and asks, V'ela ba lamali, but if that's true, so then what do we need ba for? Because ba in the previous summon was used to exclude truma from the carbon olav v'yored. Let's say somebody ate truma when they were tameh, but now we don't need to exclude it anymore because there's no reason that we ever would have included it. Rashi says, ba lamali lemu'ute truma. Why do we need ba to exclude truma? How would you ever know that it's chayiv? Demehani lo asya sheken kares. You can't learn it out from the cases of kares, like Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav, because there is no kares by truma. So again, what do we need ba for? And the Gemara says the ba is l'rabos nivlas oftar, to include a situation. Let's say the person became tameh specifically by swallowing an oftar, which was a nevela, a kosher bird that was a nevela. Rashi says l'rabos nivlas oftar hamitama bebeis habliya, because the tumah by nivlas oftar is only when it happens when the person swallows it. Shem achla v'nichnas lemikdash chayiv, meaning if someone eats a nevelas oftar and enters the Beis HaMikdash, he's chayiv. So that's a unique kind of tumah. So we use the word ba to include again that situation of tumah of nivlas oftar. But the Gemara says, 1 second, how could the word ba be an inclusion? Ha'amrid ba miyutahu. We just said on the previous summit that ba was an exclusion, and now we're saying it's an inclusion to include nivlas oftar. And the Gemara answers to that, mishum de miyutahu ayaser, because the fact that it's an exclusion, that's actually why it can include in this case. Why? Because it's written, it says that the person touches the bar negia in the lav bar negia lo. So from there we would have known only something that you're touching, not something that you don't become tameh through touching. So that also excluded nivlas oftar. Uchsiv ba miyuta. So now you have ba as a miyut as well. That's two exclusions of nivlas oftar. But have a miyut achar miyut, that becomes an exclusion following an exclusion. Ve'ein miyut achar miyut ela l'ravos. The rule is that if you have a double exclusion, it actually is an inclusion, and that's why we end up including nivlas oftar. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Yesh ba yediyah betchila ve'ein ba yediyah besof. Let's say the person knew that there was tumah, he was aware of the tumah in the beginning, then there was a lapse of awareness, and then he never finds out at the end that he actually committed the aveir of Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav. So then the seir hanasa b'fnim v'chulu. Then the Mishnah said that the goat that is brought inside, this is the seir from Yom Kippur, that's going to be tola, that's going to suspend any punishment, and when the person eventually finds out that he committed the aveira, then he's going to bring the appropriate carbon, the carbon olav v'yored. And the Gemara says, Tana Rabban, and the rabbis taught, v'chibar al hakodesh mitumos b'nei Yisrael. It says by the sir hanasa b'fnim that acts as a kapara al hakodesh from tumah. That's exactly what we're talking about over here. And so the Brisa says, yeshli be'inyan zel lahavi shalosh tumas. Now I might have thought, what does it mean mitumos b'nei Yisrael? I might have thought it means the following three tumas. It includes the following: tumas avodah zara, v'tumas giloi arayos, v'tumas shrichas damim. Maybe the seir hanasa b'fnim brings a kapara, brings an atonement for the committing the sin of avodah zara, the sin of Gilui Arayos, the sin of Shrichas Damim, that's avodah zara, illicit relationships, and murder. All of those are referred to as tumah. So maybe that's what it means when it says v'chibra ala kodesh mitumos b'nei Yisrael. It means those three averis. And how do we know that they're all referred to as tumah? Because we see that in Psukim, ba'avodah zara hu omer, by avodah zara it says leman tameis mikdash, uses the word tumah. B'gilui Arayos hu omer shmartim es mishmarti levilti asos meichukos hatoevos v'lo setamu bohem, uses the word tumah. And b'shrichas damim hu omer, by murder as well it says v'lo setamu, it uses the word tumah. So Yachal al Gimel Tumas Halalu Yehesar Mechaper, one might think that it's on these three tumas that the sar is Mechaper. Talmud Lomer mi tumos b'nei Yisrael, it says from the tumos b'nei Yisrael, the low kol tumos, it means mi tumos and not all tumos. And Rashi explains, mitumos v'lo kol tumos v'hoel v'lo pirish loch al ezu mehem, since it doesn't explain specifically which one, it's only some of them, lo mosron el chachamim, it must be given over to the chachamim, lefaresh al ezu medaber, to explain on what specific tumah we're talking about, say ulamad bebinyan av, and we can learn it out through a binyan av, and so therefore again that's how we know it's not al gimel tumos halalu, because it's not kol tumos. And ma motzinu, what do we find? That's the binyan av over here, shechilek hakosov mechlal kol tumos. What do we find where the pasuk, it separates one kind of tumah from all other kinds? Haveyomer tumas mikdash v'kadashav. That's referring to tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Afkan, so too over here, but tumas mikdash v'kadashav. We're talking about tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. These are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. Rashi explains, Ma matzinu shachila kilomar ezo tumah matzinu chaluka b'makom acher. What kind of tumah do we find distinct in another context? That's tumas mikdash v'kadashav. That's tumas mikdash v'kadashav. Ulekamon mefarish lahaycha. The Gemara will explain this part later on, what that means, that it's choluk. Afkan shechilek lios bechapara, so to here where it's distinguished, it's distinct that there's a kapara for it, again with this soyer hanasa bifnim, ve'in shar tumasimon, it's distinct only that and not others. Dasha betumas mikdash v'kadashav hakasim medaber, you should know that we're talking about tumas mikdash v'kadashav. That's how Rabbi Yehuda learns that out. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, mimakomo hu muchra, you don't need to learn out from any other places, you can learn out from this source itself. Harei hu Omer, because the pasuk says, v'chibar ala kodesh mitumos, it says that it's going to be a kapara al hakodesh, on that which is holy, mitumos, from the impurity, and we understand mitumos shel kodesh, that it means to say tumos shel kodesh, tumos that have to do with the holy. And Rashi explains, you don't need to find another source. From the language of the pasuk itself, we can see that it's talking about tumas mikdash v'kadashav. And Rabbi Shimon continues, again Rabbi Shimon says, you see over here, v'chiper al kodesh mitumos, that it's mitumos shel kodesh, yachol al kol tumas shebekodesh yehei soyer zeh mechaper. Now one might think that on all situations of tumah by kodesh, this soyer hanasa b'fnim is mechaper. Rashi explains, yachol al kol tumas shebekodesh, bein sheyesh bo yediyah, bein she'ein bo yediyah. Maybe whether there was knowledge of the tumah and whether there wasn't knowledge. Again, the case over here specifically was that there was knowledge in the beginning, but there was no knowledge in the end. But maybe it should be in all scenarios where there was yediyah or there was not yediyah. Again, yachol al kol tumah shebekodesh yehei soyer zeh mechaper. I might think on all those scenarios of tumah bekodesh, the soyer is mechaper. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, "Umi pishayim l'chol chatosam." It talks about sins that are pishia, which are generally b'mezid, and it talks about chatosam, talks about sins that are by mistake. And we learn from there, chatoim dumyo de pishayim. We compare the chatoim to the pishayim. Ma pishayim she'enam b'nei karban, just like if it's done on purpose, there's no karban. Af chatoim, so too when we're talking about chatoim she'enam b'nei karban, we're talking specifically about those that are not b'nei karban. Rashi explains that, Ma pishayim she'enam b'nei karban she'en pesha elamezid. Again, pesha is b'mezid. There's no carbon there. So af chatoim sheinam b'nei carbon. So too the chatoim that are atoned for with the sar hanasa b'fnim have to be einon b'nei carbon, meaning yotza sheyesh ba yediyah b'tchila v'yediyah basof. That already excludes a situation where you had knowledge in the beginning and the end, the helim b'tayim, and there was a lapse of awareness in the interim. Shibas carbon. There you would bring a carbon. You were aware of the sin. You would bring the carbon olav yored. So that's already for sure excluded. If there was yediyah b'tchila and yediyah basof, that's going to be excluded from the comparison to Peshoim. So again, that's why chatoim she'enam b'nei carbon, that's why that's excluded. Uminayin liyesh ba yediyah b'tchila ve'ein ba yediyah b'sof. Now, how do we know that it's specifically in a case where there was yediyah in the beginning and no yediyah at the end? Shesor zetola, that what happens is that this soyer suspends the judgment until you find out that there was a sin, and then you bring the appropriate carbon. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, l'chol chatosam, for all of their sins, chayivei chatos b'mashva. It has to be something where there would be a liability in theory to bring a carbon. Rashi explains, meaning, how do we know there has to be some kind of knowledge in the beginning? Maybe we should say that the sar hanasa b'fnim atones in a situation where there was no yediyah whatsoever, not in the beginning or the end. How do we know it specifically where there was yediyah in the beginning and not at the end? Afal pishi ein bas carbon. Again, that's a situation where there is no carbon. In a situation of no yediyah b'tchila, there's no carbon at all. So it says l'chol chatosam. It means haroi lavo l'chlal chatos. basam. It has to be a specific scenario where there is a possibility that you'll have to bring a korban. Yatsa she'ein ba yediyah betchila, that would exclude a case where there was no yediyah in the beginning. She'ein ba l'chalal chatas od liolam, there's never going to be a chatas. So again, the sor hanasa b'fnim specifically atones for a case where there was yediyah betchila and there was no yediyah basof. So it's a case which could eventually come to a korban, but there is no particular korban right now because there's a lack of awareness. So again, it holds it in suspension. It suspends the punishment, so to speak. And when the person finds out that there was a sin, they will bring the proper korban of the korban olavi yored. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, we just said above, Yeshli binyan zel lahavi gimel tumos, tumas avodah zara, v'tumas gilei arayos, v'tumas shrichas damim. It said, I might have thought that what the sar hanasa b'fnim atones for is avodah zara, gilei arayos, and shrichas damim. And the Gemara now clarifies this line. How could we possibly have thought that? Hay avodah zara hechi dami. Let's say by avodah zara, what exactly are we talking about? Ibn Mezid, if we're saying that there's an atonement for avodah zara done on purpose, bar katalus, there's no atonement for that. The punishment over there is the death penalty. And Ibn Shogeg, if we're talking about that it was done by mistake, bar karbanhu, so there already is a korban that is actually brought. So again, it's not going to be this korban. There's a specific korban that is brought for that avera. And so the Gemara continues and answers, b'mezid v'lo asrube. We're talking about a situation, for example, of done on purpose, but there was no warning. If there's no warning, then there is no death penalty. Or you could have a case of b'shogeg v'lo isyadale. You could have a case that it's done by mistake, but the person isn't aware, and so therefore the korban's not brought. And Rashi explains, b'mezid v'lo asrube ve'eno nereg b'lo asra. Person is not killed without warning. V'lo isyadale, or you can have b'shogeg where he's not aware. Salkadai t'chamina lisli le lohagin v'nai yisur. Maybe this would be again a case where it protects him from afflictions. It's like held in suspension ad sheyivad alo, until the person does become aware. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ches Amud Aleph.